The 1820s, Missouri Territory. George Hearst didn't have a lot going for him. Born into poverty, the oldest of 3 children, he spent most of his days working on the family farms that seemed to constantly be in debt. He didn't have much time for formal education, not that it would really have mattered. This was Missouri, before Missouri was a thing. Schooling was the least of most people's concerns. In his free time, him and his friends would watch the local prospectors dig for lead in the mines. If they were lucky, they'd be allowed to dig through the piles of extra dirt to see if anybody missed anything. While he would spend much of his time on the farm, he would try and spend as much time as he could reading about mining. Or at least, he tried to. You gotta think, he didn't have that much education, so he probably wasn't all that literate. But either way, George, this young child, yearned for the mines. As he reached young adulthood, his father passed away, leaving all the responsibilities of running the farms and paying off all the family debts to George himself. But George managed to do all of this, and more, with relative ease. George had a gift, almost a supernatural ability to sense where rare metals and gems were hidden within the earth. And it didn't take long for him to use this skill to pay back all the money his family owed. But he wanted more out of life than just running these failing farms, and felt his talents were wasted in Missouri. By the late 1840s, gold had been discovered out west, and many people were willing to venture out there for a chance to strike it rich. Literally. George, confident in his knowledge on mining and other things, ventured out west to claim his fortune. And at first, it didn't work. Yeah, he just didn't find anything. But over time, as he kept moving forward, checking the earth for shiny spots, eventually he found gold, and this changed his life forever. George had suddenly become a very wealthy man with this one simple trick. He would scout out an area, identify parts that he suspected to have a lot of mining potential, and then buy up, or lease the rights to the area. More often than not, he'd find something fancy out there, and then would sell the rights of that land to someone else, making a huge profit on the thing. And George was really good at this. Nobody knows for sure why George had this ability, whether he learned some secret in those Missouri mines as a kid, or maybe he actually just knew how to read. But pretty quickly, George was becoming a captain of industry. As he made more money, he could afford to buy more land, to make his own mines, to sell more, make more, and repeat this process over and over again. George had a new life out west, and had little reason to return back to Missouri. But once his mother fell ill, he came back east, and back at home, he met someone, a woman named Phoebe, who was half his age. They quickly fell in love, although Phoebe's parents objected to the whole relationship, likely in large part to the fact that she was just 19 and George was 40. But that didn't matter. Within 2 years, the couple were married and had a son, a boy named after George's father, William Hearst. Now, after the birth of his son, George wasn't quite ready to settle down. Like, yeah, he had a lot of money and a wife and a new kid, but that wasn't really George's style. So he kind of just left. He didn't get a divorce with Phoebe, he kind of just went back out west, back to the mines, and to buy real estate, and bet on horses. He'd write letters, and I'd assume maybe visit once in a while, but most of the time he was just on the other side of the country from his family. Phoebe, a young new wife and mother, also didn't seem to want to stay around the house. She was off to Europe, visiting that whole part of the world, while the young baby William was left in the care of, this nurse, I guess. I don't know what her name was. As you can imagine, Will's childhood was a bit odd. I mean, for one, neither of his parents were often around when he was a small child. His mother would show up sometimes in between her lengthy vacations, but it would only be for a brief time until she went on to her next adventure. When she was home, she treated Will very well. Maybe too well, spoiling him as much as possible, and avoiding any discipline for his actions. Will would end up going out of his way to try and get a reaction from his mother, setting off fireworks in his room, or spilling oil on valuable clothing just to see what would happen, but his mother never seemed to care or notice. Will was constantly afraid that his mother would just leave and never come back, but I'm sure that won't leave any lasting psychological damage. Once Will was 10 years old, his life would change significantly. Phoebe decided to start taking him on her fancy vacations. Yes, the young Will was spending much of his time in Europe, with evenings spent with royalty, visiting various castles, and meeting the Pope, amongst other European things. Phoebe, who had been studying to be a teacher before her marriage to George, taught Will many things herself, and for the rest of Will's childhood, the two were pretty much inseparable. George was somewhere out west, betting much of his wealth on the horses. He lost some money, made some money, lost a lot of money, so much that Phoebe started to fear for the family's well-being, but it was just a matter of time before George made a lot of money. George ended up finding a plot of land to create his homestake mine, which would have so many fancy metals and jewels and gems that would eventually generate the modern equivalent of several $billion over the course of the next few decades. There was so much in this land that the mine would continue operation until 2001. By this point, George had pretty much all the money he could ever want. His various mines would continue to make money year over year, and he was set. Kind of. George was always interested in expanding beyond the mines. His family had ran a general store, and in the decades since he left Missouri, he would try his hand at a lot of businesses. One of these businesses was the newspapers. The written press was invaluable for swaying public opinion, and George had a lot of messages he wanted to communicate. In the past, he had used his papers to try and convince local residents that his mining operations would be good for the town. But now he was looking at buying a paper in San Francisco for a completely different purpose: politics. He wanted to run for office. Back in these days, there was no better way to promote yourself as a potential candidate for office than to do it through your own newspaper. Sure, you could argue there was a bit of a conflict of interest, but that didn't seem to bother George much at all. George's San Francisco Examiner wasn't too much more than a thinly veiled attempt to promote himself as a viable candidate for governor, which didn't really work out. He would become a senator though, so it wasn't a complete waste. With George's ambitions growing, his son and wife were still on the other side of the country, and Will was growing up. He was getting ready to go off to college, Harvard, and for the first time in his life, he would be left on his own, to forge his own path, build his own legacy. But not really though. Will had the special distinction at Harvard for being the guy with the rich parents. As you can imagine, Will, being the student with virtually unlimited funds, became quite popular rather quickly. Will threw fancy parties, and his allowance was more than enough to cover anything he, his friends, or close associates could ever want or need. He had an alligator on a leash that he took to class named Champagne Charlie, because he liked to drink champagne. The alligator liked to drink champagne. But it wasn't all just fun and games. Being the richest kid on campus came with some responsibilities. For example, the Harvard Lampoon usually gave the position of business editor to the student with the most money. This was because the paper was constantly losing money, and it was assumed that the student could just eat the cost. Will was fine becoming business editor of the Lampoon. Against all odds, or expectations, he was actually pretty good at it. He had a knack for selling advertisement space. He just seemed to exude some natural charm that got people excited to do business with him. And eventually, rather than just losing money, the Lampoon was actually making some. However, this success did not translate over to the rest of Will's college career. He was not the best student by any means, not because he was necessarily unintelligent, it's just that between his various parties and pranks and playing with alligators, he just didn't seem to find the time to show up to class. Now, it wasn't like he was getting drunk every night and every day. In fact, he had given up alcohol entirely halfway through college. He realized that by not drinking, by being the only sober person in the room, he became the de facto leader, a position he seemed to enjoy. A lot of his time just seemed to get taken up attending local shows, particularly watching chorus girls. But even with his father's influence, Harvard had enough, and Will was expelled. After getting kicked out of Harvard with no definable skills or aspirations, Will didn't have a lot of options. I mean, sure, there was his father, who surely would be more than willing to give his only son some position in the family business, and he did. Will was sent to the mines. It builds character. Will wasn't a huge fan of this. I mean, going from European vacations and partying at Harvard to, a coal mine is going to be a hard transition for anyone. Will didn't intend on staying here for long. No siree, his time at Harvard was hugely influential. He was bit by that journalism bug, and felt that was his true destiny. Will spent the next few months writing letters to his father as frequently as possible, asking him in increasingly humorous ways to just hand over control of the San Francisco Examiner to his only beloved child. Now, George didn't really have that much use for the paper by this point. It had already fulfilled its purpose. He was now a well-established figure within the political landscape, and the paper just wasn't profitable, so handing it off to Will wasn't really going to hurt anything, right? It was very low risk, no reward, and eventually George relented, giving his son control over the Examiner. While Will had managed to make the Harvard Lampoon a successful paper, this was going to be different. This was no college rag. The Examiner had well-established competition in the city. It was getting destroyed by the other outlets. He would need to actively convince the residents of San Francisco to abandon their favorite papers and move to his. He had a plan. In the late 1800s, journalism, the news, was not anything like it is today. Papers were written and made to appeal to a very specific demographic, not just for people holding specific political views, but ethnic groups. Most of the reports were about things that might affect the lives of the community members, often with heavy doses of bias that would appeal to those readers. But that didn't necessarily mean the papers were all that interesting. The news was seen as something uncontrollable. Journalists were just expected to report what they saw, what happened, and what was relevant, but not much more. But huge changes were happening across the country, and Hearst was probably taking note. Joseph Pulitzer was revolutionizing the news. He had ran a paper in St. Louis before moving to New York, and his style of selling papers was unlike anything most had seen before. He appealed to the largest demographic possible, the working class immigrants, hosting political opinion pieces that would appeal to them, sure, but also he made a few changes to the well-established formula, rather than just report the news. Pulitzer's writers were tasked with making the news. Not all stories had to be about things that would directly affect readers' lives. Anything can be the news, it just depends how you present it. Pulitzer managed to captivate more people with human interest stories, tales of crime, violence, scandal, stuff that was not necessary information for the readers. But it was interesting. This was not the birth of sensationalism, but it was certainly taking it in bold new directions. By plastering giant headlines on the front of papers and using pictures and drawings, Pulitzer managed to captivate everybody, from kids interested in the cartoons to immigrants just starting to learn English. Especially in New York City, Pulitzer was taking over the newspaper industry, and Hearst seemed to have a similar strategy for his paper in San Francisco. So Hearst got to work, with his strategies planned out. Hire journalists to investigate stories, find compelling new details to write about, and create engaging narratives for the audience to keep coming back for. And within just 2 weeks, he was arrested for accusing a local lawyer of corruption. Yeah, I guess libel laws were a thing back then. But soon he was out of jail, armed with not only the connections he made from the Lampoon, but also his father's unlimited wealth. Turns out when you have access to all the money you could possibly want, you can hire anyone you want. And that's exactly what Hearst did. Offer a lot of money to all the most talented people around, and build an ace team of reporters. And it wasn't just the money that made people want to work with Will. He had a certain charisma, a charm that made people like him. He was friendly, never seemed to get upset, never raised his voice, and even let his writers drink on the job, as long as they got their jobs done. The topics of Will's papers usually promoted his political views, which were confusing. In the late 1800s, wealth and status were completely different concepts than that of today. There was the elite, the old money, the families whose wealth had been inherited over the course of many generations. They had tight-knit social clubs, married each other, held fancy dinner parties, and laughed at all the silly common folk. And then there was the new money. The Second Industrial Revolution had created a whole lot of opportunities for people to get rich quick. And this was a seismic shift in the existing social hierarchy. Will was born into wealth, sure, but his father was born into poverty. Hearst would never truly be old money, not that he necessarily wanted to be a part of that crowd anyway, but all this seemed to put a chip on his shoulder, a resentment against the elite that was often reflected in his papers. He fought against the largest trusts, the captains of industry, and presented himself as the champion of the common man. While this might have been in part just a way to gain readers' respect, it does seem like Hearst genuinely believed all of this. But this doesn't mean he was ashamed of his father's wealth. No, not by any means. In fact, he flaunted his cash as much as possible. Will was a lot of things, but he was never good with money. He didn't seem to grasp the concepts of profit or even sustainability. And somehow, through his personal expenditures, the massive parties he'd throw, and the cost of running his newspaper, he managed to spend more of his parents' money than his parents did. It wasn't all a waste. He was showing results. In the 3 years since he had gained control of the Examiner, he had grown the circulation of the paper by tenfold, which would be great if it was actually making money. Accounting for inflation, Will had spent the modern equivalent of $4 million to get the paper to increase its circulation. So even after all of this, after taking over the San Francisco newspaper market, Will was still completely reliant on his mother and father to give him money from month to month. This was starting to have an effect on his personal life. Remember how Hearst had an affection for those chorus girls? Well, dating somebody outside of the wealthy elite in this day would have been quite scandalous, and reflected poorly on both Will and his family to the rest of high society. Will wasn't bothered by any of this, but his mother was. And because Will's mom still gave him money, she had a lot of power over his life. He had to play by his mom's rules if he wanted to continue his lifestyle. This all changed though in 1891, when George Hearst passed away. With all the mining operations and other businesses he had created over his life, George was leaving behind a fortune equivalent to around $700 million in 2023 money. And since Will was the only child, he was gonna get that money. At the age of 28, he was ready to take life into his own hands, quit going to his parents for money, and make a name for himself, on his own terms, with his father's inheritance. But that wasn't gonna happen. George didn't leave Will a dime. He didn't trust him. Nobody trusted him. George left the entire fortune to his wife Phoebe, and this put Will in an incredibly uncomfortable position. While he had a very close relationship with his mother, she was the sole person giving him money, and she had complete control over his life. Will was ready to move on to bigger things. He was done with the Examiner. He was finally ready to settle down. For the past 10 years, he had been dating a waitress named Tessie, and Will planned on asking her to marry him. Phoebe was never a big fan of Tessie. She told her son, "If you don't break it off right now, you won't get a cent." And so Will was left with a very important decision to make. The woman he loved, or a lot of money. He chose the money.
Oh, come on!
Hello, Jimmy. Your defenses are terrible. You're lucky I wasn't a dangerous internet ne'er-do-well, or I could have gotten your personal information.
What does this have to do with the internet? You just broke down my wall.
It's a metaphor, Jimmy.
A metaphor for what?
A metaphor for your lack of online security, which is why you need NordVPN, the sponsor of today's video. NordVPN is a virtual private network which allows you to browse the internet safe and secure, with your identity hidden and your IP safe. NordVPN has thousands of servers worldwide to enjoy access to an internet without borders or restrictions, like a chameleon.
What does that mean?
You know, just as chameleons can change their appearance on a whim, you can change servers and locations whenever.
Yeah, but chameleons change colors. They don't transportate.
You've become a buzzkill lately, man. Like, come on. NordVPN makes sure your internet is safe behind a wall of protection. Turn on CyberSec to block malware and ads. Protect up to 6 devices with one account. Phone, laptop, TV, even your toaster.
Warning, does not protect toast.
It's never been easier to start. And right now you can get a 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus 4 additional months for free when you use my link, nordvpn.com/althist. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee.
Okay, that sounds good, but, I might need to hold off on that considering how there is a hole in my wall now.
Not to worry, Jimmy. NordVPN can fix structural damage too. There! Fixed!
Wow, thanks. That patched up nothing.
Well, how about patching up your attitude, Jimmy? How about that? That's nordvpn.com/althist, or click the link in the description below. It's the best deal on the internet, and risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee.